Let's just talk about President Buhari, who on Thursday, Wednesday, presented his new National Economic Development Plan 2021-2025. That new plan replaced the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, or ERGP, which was floated in 2017 to tackle the country's economic recession of the year 2016. Now, my guest on the show to discuss the new plan and the scenarios for its implementation and what the funding model should be is Professor Franklin Ngwu. He's a faculty member and director of sustainability at the Lagos Business School. He's live here in our Lagos studios. Great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Let's just get started. It looks like everyone understands what it is, but what is a National Development Plan, basically speaking?
A National Development Plan is more or less a plan in line with the vision of the country in terms of what you think that you want to achieve in X, Y, Z years. So, of course, now we have a 5-year development plan. So it means that this is the plan through which Nigeria will draw its agenda in terms of what it wants to achieve, in terms of what infrastructure, human capital development, and all that. So it's more or less, it's the same thing as when a private firm talks about a 5-year strategy plan. So it's like a strategy plan, actually, but we now call it a national development plan. So in a private sector, in a firm, it's called a strategy plan. In a public sector, it's called a national development plan. So it's more or less a plan that helps you in line with your vision to say, this is what we want to do in the first year, in the second year, in the third year, in the fifth year. So at the end of the 5 years, you will now say, okay, this is what I achieved, and this, well, of course, you know, you also have to be doing a kind of review. So after the first year, you can sit back and say, did I meet my target of this first year of the 5-year development plan? So it's more or less a plan you use to move the country forward.
What makes this plan different from the ERGP, by the way?
It's more or less, of course, you know, when we had the ERGP, it was more or less a plan to develop the country as well. But of course, you know, we had COVID, which really more or less disrupted all the plans. So more or less, this development plan is, ERGP has expired. It was expired in 2020. So this new plan is now taking us from 2021 to 2025. As I said, is a 5-year development plan.
Now, do you think this 5-year plan it has enough timeline to allow for its thorough implementation on the set objectives? And we just showed that a little bit earlier on. It's going to focus on science and technology. The idea is to lift 35 million people out of poverty, which Mr. President says will be the foundation for the 100 million that he talked about over a 10-year period. So do you think 5 years is a good period through which we can actually achieve that?
So in terms of if 5 years is enough, of course, 5 years can be said to be good. But however, the problem is not really the duration. A key problem is in terms of the implementation. Of course, this new development plan is going to look at 6 key areas: growth and development, infrastructure, public sector, social development, and regional development. So looking at it is quite commendable. It's quite robust. It's good. But the question, you know, when you develop a strategy plan or development plan, there are certain questions that you normally ask. The first one is, do you have the right resources? The second one is, do you have the right people? The third one is, do you have the right culture? And the fourth one is, do you have the execution roadmap? So when we ask these questions, why the development plan is very good, is very detailed, but when you now ask these questions, I'm not sure that the eyes will have it, as we normally say in National Assembly.
So, but then, what does it really take to implement a national development plan? How much of the details of this new one do we really have?
It's been around in terms of when it was launched, when it was started around August, September. They've been working on it. So it's there, but it's important that the federal government communicate more with regards to this development plan. I mean, few people, some Nigerians are aware of it, but there is need for more communication. And this is also this is not just for the development plan. It's also relating to all the activities of the government. It seems, I'm not sure I'm correct, but it seems that Nigerians are more or less not too, I'm not sure they are listening very well in terms of the media, the information team of the government. I'm not sure they are communicating well in terms of the government, what the government is doing. I'm not sure also that Nigerians are listening very well in terms of what the government is doing. So there's a kind of distrust, or there's a kind of gap between particularly the private sector and the public sector. So there's a need to bridge this gap so that people can actually know and say, okay, we have a strategy, we have a plan. How do we key into it? How do we join into it to achieve it? Because of course, you need different stakeholders to make this to happen. So I think it has to be better communicated. They have to engage more people. Even though in the plan, it is said that they have engaged different stakeholders, but I think that more can be done.
But in terms of engaging the stakeholders, I'm sure the ERGP was a lot much louder than this National Development Plan.
I agree. The ERGP, of course, it was louder. People got more involved. The campaign was there. It was better communicated. So it might be that this new development plan, maybe we can say that other activities like COVID, of course, COVID took over everything last year, this year. So it might be that the communication was more with regards to the issues of COVID, the way we're handling insecurity, but in terms of the development plan, I think it needs to be more communicated so that people can really know that it's there. It's there, but the majority of Nigerians are not really sure and they're not really aware in terms of the content, in terms of what they want to achieve. But of course, as I said, it's quite a detailed plan. But the question then is, how do you execute?
A national development plan, Professor Franklin, when it's been launched in other jurisdictions, it makes a whole lot of big splash. You not just in terms of whether the event or the venue where it's been held, that's not what I mean, but in terms of who and who are part of it in terms of, do we have the World Bank, the IMF, the critical international stakeholders, maybe the AFDB, the other DFIs, who would say, or the big industries or companies around the world who will say, yes, this is what it is. What is the peg of this particular one in which it looks like we just rolled it in? Is it all just about COVID or the fact that this phase one of it, which was to be part of the Agenda 2050, is phase one, but just being sneaked in under the cover of the budget 2022 and everything else that when you guys are beginning to be in the festive mood?
No, I think even the festival, I think I will say that, this is part of the Agenda 2050. So we have 2021 to 2025. We have 2026 to 2030, which is been happening. And I also believe that the international, like IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, all of them are aware of this plan. All of them, they will also contribute in terms of when you talk about the funding of this plan. They will also contribute. Of course, it's quite a very elaborate in terms of what they want to achieve. We are looking at about close to 350 trillion naira investment. So it's huge. And I'm sure for you to be able to mobilize that, you will definitely look for different stakeholders.
Now we're going to share the money or the responsibility. They will not share the money, but they can share the responsibility after the break. We'll talk to that. Funding President Buhari's new national development after the break. You're welcome back to our Rise Exchange. President Buhari's new 5-year national development plan is expected to cost 348 billion naira and funded by a trillion naira, and that's about 85.7% of that will be contributed by the government, 14.3% by the private sector. So the government is taking the lion's share of close to 300 trillion naira of that. The target is to lift 35 million Nigerians out of poverty, according to President Buhari. Let's chew this over now with Professor Franklin Ngwu of the Lagos Business School. Prof, the headline figure here is about 384 trillion naira. Over a 5-year period, the private sector will take some, the government will take some. So let me start on the side of the private sector. What role do you think the private sector should play beyond bringing some funds to the table? And we're going to get to how do they put the funds on the table. But how critical is the role of the private sector in getting this National Development Bank delivered?
I would say that the private sector is the fulcrum for this plan to work. In the sense that if you look at what we are looking at, 348 trillion is huge. And of course, the government, there's no money to fund this kind of. So from what we gathered, the private sector will fund 85%, almost 200-something trillion. The federal government will fund, the federal government and the state government will fund about 15%, and the federal government will now contribute about 29 trillion, while the subnational, the state will contribute about 20 trillion. So it's huge. So it means that for us to work, as I earlier said, if you want to execute a project, you have to ask, do you have the resources? So the resources is a key challenge. And that is why we're saying that the private sector actually is the fulcrum upon which this depends. And of course, for you to achieve any meaningful, sustainable, and inclusive development, it is the responsibility of the private sector. But what is required is for the federal government, the state government, to provide the appropriate environment that will enable the private sector to really do what they are supposed to do, to really do what they know how to do. In terms of, so for instance, we're talking about creating jobs, inclusive development, agriculture, infrastructure, social development, regional development. All this will be done by the private sector. The federal government, they don't have the capacity and they don't have the resources to execute some of these projects. So it depends on the way they bring love, romance, negotiate with the private sector so that they will be able to bring this money. And of course, the money is there, locally and internationally. So we have a significant amount of the global investable funds, any negative interest. So what is now required is how do you create the right environment so that these funds that are lying negative in different parts of the world will start finding their way to Nigeria. And if they start finding their way to Nigeria, we have the local private sector participants who will collaborate with these global ones to really achieve what we want to achieve. So it's left for the federal government to say, okay, how do we, three key variables, rule of law, regulatory quality, and government effectiveness, which we now dovetail into ease of doing business in Nigeria. If we're able to do that, of course, we will be able to attract these funds to come into Nigeria. So of course, foreign direct investment is declining. So how do we reverse it and say, okay, in Africa, in emerging markets, in developing countries, that Nigeria becomes number one point in terms of where this FDI will go. So these are the challenges or the responsibility of the federal government to address some of these issues.
For those of you who are economists and for Nigerians, what should they look out for when we say we're funding the National Development Plan? Is it going to come through the annual budgeting process? Or are we going to start making provision in the budget to say this goes for the National Development Plan? Or we just go to roadshows to get foreign investors to say, look, this is how we put it in. How will it really work? It's
going to be a combination. So we're told that the 2022 budget will come from this, what we are going to execute in the 2022 budget will be part of,
is a product of
this NDP. Yeah. So it means that if we say, okay, we are looking at 16 trillion or 18 trillion budget for 2022, as the case may be when it's finally approved, it means that we will now say, okay, how much will the federal government bring in this budget? How much will the state government bring with regards to their own responsibility in their respective states to this budget? And in line with what we want to achieve in the National Development Plan for the first year. So they will now say, okay, the federal government is doing this, state government is doing this. The remaining one will now be done by the private sector in terms of bringing the funds. So that's why I'm saying that is now how the federal government and the state government, how they relate and coordinate with the private sector to bring these funds to help us achieve what we want to achieve.
There wasn't so much of that handshake between the federal and the subnationals as far as the ERGP was concerned. In fact, at the time it ended in December last year, less than 1/4 or so of the state subnationals bought into the ERGP. Who is buying into this National Development Plan? It's supposed to start 2021 to 2025. Today is the 23rd of December. So technically, this National Development Plan is not starting in 2021. It's technically 2022. So will this National Development Plan need the approval of the Council of State? Does it need the approval of the Governors Forum? Does it need the approval of the National Assembly?
I think that the subnationals, they've been involved in the development of this National Development Plan in the sense that they had one governor per region, that is the 6 geopolitical zones that we have in Nigeria, in the discussion and the preparation of this development plan. So they are part of it. However, as you mentioned there is a need for more collaboration between the state government and the federal government. And we've argued many times that the federal government needs to look at some of the things that they are doing and ask themselves, are they doing too much? And in terms of how can they allocate more responsibilities to the state? Because, as you said, they call it National Development Plan. It means in normal climes that the subnationals should develop their own plan from these macro development plans. So it means that Lagos, Bauchi, Yobe, Enugu, Bonyi, Benue, all of them, all their plans will now come from this national development plan in regards to their regions.
So in terms of the projects that this national development plan will deliver,
yes,
between now and 2025, national development plan is essentially a state government plan. 36 plus 1 put together, I would call it one national development plan. Because again, there's no national without the subnationals.
Yes.
So we're just essentially saying that these projects will exist in one state or one region or the other between now and 2025.
Yeah, it will. But of course, you know, this is a national development plan. So,
yes.
So I would say in economics, you can say this is a macro development plan. So then after the macro, you can now start saying about the micro. The micro will now be the states. It doesn't mean that everything that the state will do will more or less detailed in this national development plan. But we are saying that the macro elements of what we are going to do, that all of us are going to be aspiring, for example, to do infrastructure. We're going to be aspiring to lift Nigerians out of poverty. We're going to be aspiring in terms of social development. We're going to be aspiring in terms of other factors that this development plan is focusing on. But the way they will do it in Sokoto might not be the same way they will do it in Cross River. It might not be the same way they are going to do it in Kebbi State, or the way they are going to do it maybe in Akwa Ibom. But of course we know where we are going. We want to lift people out of poverty. We want to create jobs. We want to do this. We want to do that. We want to do that. So it might also be, so a typical example is that there's one of the key areas that are going to help us to achieve this is science and technology. So the question is that the federal government, they have about 17 research agencies, and they've brought out good products, good ideas. The question then is, how do you commercialize it? So if we now bring in the subnationals, in the last 3 weeks, we had a forum in Oriental Hotel where the Minister of Science and Technology, Dr. Boniono, spoke, and he invited many people, private sector. We had MAN, we had NASIMA, we had NESG, so different stakeholders coming to this forum. And he was saying that if we leverage on what these guys have produced, these 17 research agencies have produced, it means Nigerians can really be industrialized. So the question then is, how do the subnationals key into this? And the session was chaired by Mr. Pascal Dozier, who displayed unparalleled commitment and energy to see that this happened. So it means that, which is now the private sector, that I'm talking about Mr. Pascal Dozier. So the question then is, how do you now bring in the private sector, the state government, the federal government, so that they can all embrace this development plan, either from the human development, either from science technology, either from poverty reduction and all that. So at the end of the day, at the end of 5 years, we can now say, yes, we've achieved this. We can now say, okay, based on this target, this is what Enugu State has done. Based on this target, this is what Lagos State has done. Based on this target, this is what these people have done. And when we collate all of them, we now achieve.
I've got one or two more questions for you on the private sector side. But again, what's the best case scenario for this moving forward? We'll be right back. Everyone, stand by. So this is the final lap of the conversation around President Buhari's new National Development Plan 2021-2025 with my guest here in Lagos, Professor Franklin Ngwu of the Lagos Business School. Thank you, Professor. Let's just continue this conversation. Give me your best case, worst case scenario, best case scenario for this National Development Plan.
First of all, as I said, it's a very good plan. It's detailed, it's ambitious, it's good.
It's a good plan on paper.
That's exactly what
you meant. I just want you to clarify.
Yes. It's a very good plan on paper. The challenge is not the formulation in strategy. The challenge is always in the execution of strategy. So the question is, the best scenario is that it is properly executed, properly as the way it is stated. But is it possible to execute like that? I'm hesitant to say yes. In this sense, you have to ask, do you have the right resources? Do you have the right people? Do you have the right culture? And do you have the right roadmap, execution roadmap? In these 4 key areas, I wouldn't say that the eyes have it. So it's quite challenging. The culture, is it there? The people, is there? The resources, is there? No, we don't. So you are talking about 348 trillion. It's huge. It's massive. Do we have the money now? Not at all. So how do we mobilize this money? It's a challenge. Remember also that we are not the only one that is looking for money. Other developing and emerging markets are also interested in. So it depends on how you present yourself, how beautiful you are, for the suitors to come to you and say, yes, Nigeria is the best environment to go to. So that's the challenge. So if we also look at it again, in terms of best case scenario is that we start executing. You know, we're entering 2022 is more or less a political year. They are looking at...
That's what it is.
Exactly.
That's where my next question really is.
So the question then is, how do we navigate this 2022 and move to 2023? And then in 2023 as well, who knows? Will PDP win? Will APC win? Will APGA win? And who will win? And who becomes the president? Will the president and the governors align themselves with this national development plan? Or will they say, no, we have a different thinking and a different approach to it? So so if that happens, this worst scenario will start happening. Another issue, supposing we do and do and do and do, and at the end of the day, we don't have the resources to execute. What then happens? Of course, you see how we are borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. So the question then is that even in firms that I consult for their strategy, when you don't have resources to execute your strategy, you're stalled. So if this happens, it means that we'll be stalled and we cannot achieve what we want to achieve. And poverty will increase, insecurity will increase, unemployment will increase. So the key thing is, how do we prepare ourselves, look very beautiful to international, local investors to say Nigeria is the best place to be, and they will help us to mobilize these resources to achieve this.
The Finance Minister, who is also in charge of budgets and national plan, is very optimistic about this plan. I don't know if you are bullish or she is bullish, that this is the document that Nigeria really needs to move us to that very next level. So we're talking about the campaign of the elections in 2022. And of course, we know what campaign historically period is for in any a transition in Nigeria, looking at the two last republics. And then, of course, we'll talk about the elections in the first quarter of 2023. This National Development Plan is not actually kicking off until 2022. So how much of this best case, worst case, best case scenario do you think we'll be able to live with?
I think that it's starting in a few days' time. You know, when you say 2022, it seems like if to say is a long. So we're looking at in some few days, we are now in 2022.
Exactly.
So in terms of the optimism of the Minister of Finance, it's expected. She's been involved. She's the coordinator. She's in it, and she's seen things that maybe some of us might not really be privy to. So it is. I commend her for that. She's optimistic. However, the best, if supposing just a scenario, that the new government, APC, wins the presidential election, and the president, that the new president believes in this national development plan, it means that the hope will be there that the president will now execute the way he's supposed to execute.
But if it's a good plan,
yes,
and you have a different political party
yes,
wins the general elections, yes, shouldn't this plan still be executed, despite President Buhari's signature on it?
Of course, but of course, you know it will always be better that it's the same party. So it's like a manifesto of the party that
But you cannot tie the next election to a national development plan.
I agree. What I'm trying to say is
yes,
that in terms of tinkering with it,
yes,
it will be, so in terms of executing it, it will be a lot easier with the same party than if another party wins. If another party wins, of course, it's a beautiful plan. They can start going with it. But naturally, a new government will want to say, this is our own plan. This is what we of course, you've been in Nigeria for some years. So you see how new government will say, okay, this is our own agenda. This is what we are implementing. This is what we are doing. So of course, you know, the current government, more or less, there are certain things that were done by Jonathan's government that are still happening now. But of course, you know, they have their own plan. So that's the challenge. But of course, it's a good plan. But the question then is, how do we execute it?
Which will be handed over to the next administration.
Exactly. But not only that, remember that this is a national development plan but of course, we have the subnationals, which is another challenge.
Here we go.
Yes.
Because they're going to be change of
different governors, different playing,
yes,
different. So the question then
winners and losers.
Winners and losers. So the question then is, the new governors that will emerge, will they even buy into this plan?
Under different political parties?
Under different political parties.
Or on the same political platform, but different mindsets.
Exactly. So these are some of the risks we have to take into consideration as we hope that this will be implemented.
The president seems determined, President Buhari, to lift millions of Nigerians out of poverty. And I give that to him. But again, do you think, as we're looking at the next 18 months or less than that of this administration, because right now, election will be in the first quarter, barring any unforeseen occurrence, so we're talking about 12 plus 3, so that's about 15 months or thereabout in office until June or so, whatever, when the handing over takes place. So, what are the quick wins do you think we can achieve? Because we're heading into 2022 and into this ERGP, this National Development Plan, with high unemployment, high inflation, very, very crazy, volatile, downside exchange rates, and disposable income of Nigerians are shrinking by the day, and the misery index is getting worse.
I think in terms of the quick wins, given the duration.
So do we really need a National Development Plan to just improve the living standards of Nigeria?
Yes, we do need a National Development Plan. Just as firms need a 5-year, 3-year, they need a strategy. So this is a strategy. So we need it. But what can be done within this period that the PMB government has is to say what are the few things that we can do in this remaining months or year, as the case may be. Let me also say that the different ministries of the government, they are doing few things. Of course, in Lagos Business School, we invite one minister every month to come and tell us what they are doing. And some of them are really doing commendable things. So what we're supposed to do is to say, okay, what are the quick wins? Number one thing is, how do we support agriculture in Nigeria? And supporting agriculture will require that we tackle insecurity significantly so that the farmers can go back to farm. If the farmers go back to farm...
Can that happen in 12, 15 months or less than that, yes, by the next season?
But I think General Magoro had an interview and he said that insecurity in Nigeria can be tackled in 6 months.
That's a television interview.
Exactly.
Whatever,
but
interview.
Of course,
it's easier said, anybody can say.
Yes, but of course, what I'm trying to say that he's a general, he's been in the military, so things can be done. But I'm not saying it can be eradicated completely, but what we are saying
that... You can have a pushback.
You can have, exactly. So yes. But it's possible to see how we can... The government is trying their best, but they can try a lot better to reduce insecurity in Nigeria. By the time insecurity goes down, farmers can go back, but also in how do government really bring the private sector to support agriculture. That is one of the quick wins we're going to have. If you look at the import bill agriculture, we have a trade deficit running into billions or trillions. Yes. So the question then is, how do we change that scenario so that we can start become a net exporter of food than a net importer of food? That will help us. Then as we move into 2023, the next government can now start saying, another quick win also is, how do we actually embrace some of these ideas, products of these 17 research agencies of the Federal Ministry of Science and Technology. Because some of them, they already have brake parts, they already have food, they already have things. All they are looking for is how do they commercialize it.
And that's where the private sector comes in.
Comes in, exactly. So the question is, how do we incentivize them so that they can really come in? This can be done in 3 months, in 6 months, and they can start producing. So it's one example is brake pad. It's one example is one example is the tea. As well, some of the things that I was there at the rent, and it was mind blowing. It was interesting. So how do we mobilize agriculture, science and technology that will help us to at least leapfrog
light manufacturing,
which is more or less first industrial revolution, which will now take us into the second, into the third, before we now start aspiring to know if we can achieve fourth industrial revolution.
Because again, without your quick wins, I'm not too sure how much of these big wins you can make.
Exactly. So I mean, the quick wins are more or less the bedrock or the foundations that will help us to now start moving forward as we move along.
Okay. Let's leave it there for tonight. I'm sure we'll hear a whole lot more about this plan. Professor Franklin Ngwu of the Lagos Business School. Thank you so much, Director of Sustainability Center. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.